and make a diagnosis, or a much like more kind of, I don't know, all these sort of derivations of it. And one of the struggles that physicians have, the tensions that we have, is we won't know how it got to the conclusion it got to. So if it says that little, when you look at a CT scan of a chest for lung cancer, there's like literally 1,000 tiny dots, and some of them are a growth and some of them are normal anatomy, and some of those growths are cancer and some of those growths are just, I don't know, they're just a growth. And if the computer is able to sort out all of those hundreds of little dots and figure out which one, but I can't understand why, am I really going to cut that person open and take out part of their lung?
Mm-hmm.
So that to me feels like, it feels like the emerging, like the next book that's going to come out, right? The next, in 5 years, that's going to be a case study to some extent. And I'm trying to think about like, what are the big themes that we're getting from this class? And it feels like opacity is one of them.
Right. And you're right that machine learning and neural network learning, these forms of, I guess you'd call it artificial intelligence software, are almost by their nature not intelligible. Not intelligible because they're like Google's, the software that Google uses to distinguish between cat videos and other kinds of videos. There's no algorithm which it has created. Instead, there's just a similarity space, which it has, through exposure to millions of videos, a neural network has sorted videos into the cats, the dogs, and the steam engines. And without the programmer, without the artificial intelligence researcher, knowing really what went into that classification. That's exactly the point that you're making, as opposed to software which is literally algorithmic. And algorithmic software in a control system is basically if then. If this set of measurements occurs, then open this valve. And of course, very complex logical conjunctions can be created. But at any point, it is possible to kind of decode, why is the system in this circumstance? Why is it in this state? And in the case of machine learning and the kind of diagnosis that you're talking about, it is impossible to do that. All you get is what the outcome is, which is worrisome. It doesn't mean that it's not a valuable tool. It just means we really have to think again about how much confidence we have in, kind of the results of that form of empirical learning. Yeah, go ahead, Nomodari.
Yeah. So I wasn't here for last week's lecture, so I'm not sure if I haven't caught up. But what we were just discussing related to technology really brought forth to mind and like big tech. And when we think about safety, I don't know if we've discussed it in the context of, for instance, like free and fair elections. So like those same algorithms that have outputs, like for, you're in this zip code, you're this gender, they do like these straight up classifications. But right now, I feel like we're all seeing this discourse happen on the big stage. So for instance, like Zuckerberg and Bezos, their line is always that the service is free, you don't have to use it, right? But ultimately, the fallacy in that is that there's no alternative. And so I can't help but think that, particularly in this essay by Dana Powers, the emphasis on senior management's commitment to safety and how that relates to today in our like really technologically connected world. And so day to day, like of course we are still affected by things like hurricanes, Hurricane Harvey, but at the same time, there's also a greater need for like corrective action for tech. And I'm wondering if we will be covering that discussion and if there are readings that might also kind of delve into that territory.
I think you're partly what you're getting at is it's almost like a democratic demand for greater oversight, greater control of the technology systems which influence us. So we might say to Bezos or to Facebook or to Twitter management, your technology systems are objectively harming us and our democracy. That's a terrible thing, and there needs to be more control over you. How do we control industries which create public harms? This is the School of Public Policy. That's a really simple question. How do we control industries which create public harm? Legislation. We have regulatory agencies which are empowered by legislation. And why is my answer not a very satisfactory one? Well, it's because we do understand how much influence regulatory agencies and legislators are subject to when they're writing legislation or when they're writing regulation. So why are we not confident that Facebook will in fact manage hate-based or even violence-enhancing organizations during the election process? Why are we not confident? Well, because Facebook seems to have as much political power as any company on the planet, and they seem to be able to fend off regulatory and legislative remedies. It kind of seems that way. So in other words, I think the question you're raising, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is on the one hand, it's a public policy question. On the other hand, it's a really tough one because of the actual power which large corporations, including tech corporations, have in their ability to resist and avoid regulation. Is that kind of responding a little bit to your concerns? Yeah. Okay, so here's the thought yeah, more comments. Brian, did you have a comment?
No, sorry, I was yawning.
Yeah, okay. No need not to do that, so that's good. So here was my thought about a group discussion or a breakout group discussion. I am really struck by the three kinds of flaws that she finds, that Leveson finds in her space examples. So she finds flaws in safety culture, and I've kind of broken that out into overconfidence on the part of management, the safety culture, which is compromised by a demand for cost savings and cost cutting, and a failure to pay attention to the sources of system accidents as opposed to more trivial routine accidents. So those are failures of safety culture. Secondly, she identifies flaws in management and organization. Flaws, in other words, of the organization of the process, whether it's the group development process of the navigation system or the coordination of the navigation group and the propulsion group. In other words, it's either management at the local level or at this larger system level. And she refers to things like diffusion of responsibility and authority, really an important point, failures of communication or really flawed communication of technical specifications of the subsystems. I ask you to design my microwave, but I don't tell you how many watts of power I want. And so you as an engineer decide, well, he probably wants a 500 kilowatt microwave, and it actually kills my cat as soon as I turn it on. Fills the room full of, I don't have a cat, by the way. Once in a while I have mice, but I don't use the microwave to catch them. Specifications are crucial, and she finds that managers, or kind of the project management, the engineering management, are sometimes strikingly vague in the definition or specification of what the features of the components to be designed are. Lack of a master surveillance plan for system safety, production pressures, and failure to encourage and register failure, reports of failure. These are flaws in management and organization. That's a second kind of commonality that she finds in these spacecraft accidents. And then the third is kind of where I started. She finds serious failures of technical and design deficiencies. She finds deficiencies in technical and design characteristics of these systems, including testing and review processes, the protocols for testing and reviewing. As an engineer, she believes that these deficiencies should not happen. It's not that they're inevitable. It's not a Perot kind of argument. Well, you never can test adequately. Rather, as an engineer, she believes that testing procedures can be designed for system level projects, but that they have to be done very seriously, very carefully, and they need to be applied. She is a critic of unnecessary complexity. So just adding functions to a software program, she thinks is a really bad mistake, because every time you add a function, you also add a new possibility of unintended interaction. The use of legacy design with latent defects for the current mission, the fact that one generation of rocket needed a certain characteristic, that characteristic is simply brought over to the next rocket, even though it no longer needs that function. That would be legacy design. Failure to identify critical points, ways in which a system can fail. In her opinion, systems engineering requires. So we figure out what are the failure points, and then how can we design in such a way that we don't come to that failure point. And if we do come to that failure point, we exit in a safer way rather than a less safe way. And then inadequate human factor design is the other factor that she refers to. What I have in mind is to take these three sources of error, flaws in safety culture, flaws in management and organization, and flaws in technical and design, technical characteristics and design, and to apply them to one problem. So each group will have a discussion about healthcare and hospital safety. And so again, I realize you haven't done any reading about healthcare systems and hospitals, but you've all been human beings for a certain period of time. And I know that a few of you have specific expertise about healthcare and hospitals. And what is remarkable to me is that the three sources of error that she identifies, these sources of error are applicable in many, many different sectors of industrial and service activity. Banking, we could probably give a similar analysis of banking. But what I would like for you to do is spend 20 minutes discussing hospital and healthcare safety for group one on the basis of flaws in safety culture, group two, flaws in management and organization, and group three, technical and design deficiencies. So I asked you right at the beginning, imagination, stretching your ability to kind of grapple with things you haven't necessarily thought about before. This is one of those exercises. And I suggest we have 20 minutes for the breakout, and that means we'll have about 20 minutes for reporting out from the breakout also. Okay, see you in the breakout rooms.
Taking on flaws in safety culture.
Oh man. There's a lot to say.
He's gonna have a lot to say about this, and I'm curious.
Well, I don't want to bias dominate either, right? Because in some ways, sometimes it's not an advantage to be so close. So.
maybe just to get you all thinking, let's start with, I suggest you think about these first two categories, surgical errors or incorrect medications. How could flaws in safety culture lead to those bad outcomes?
So I think that something have seen, I'll just get us started, but I really don't want to dominate this whole conversation, but something really interesting that happens when folks, I don't know if anybody here has had surgery, and if you have, you actually probably don't remember because we give you something that gives you a little amnesia, but we mark we'll mark on somebody's body like where we're going to do the surgery, especially if it's one side versus the other. So if we're taking off the left leg but not the right leg, we'll mark the left leg so that we know. And people come back, and when they get to the OR, we do safety huddles. And so they're called all stops. And so the idea is like everybody stops moving, and then the nurse or the anesthesiologist reads out a series of questions and statements that we all kind of agree to or assent to. And what's interesting is that, and so supposedly, so there's a question that says, do we have all special equipment needed in the room to do the surgery? And so the idea is like, if we're going to be using, there's like really big, people always think about it as like the big thing, right? Like, are we using is this a robotic case? Is the robot in the room? But that's actually has nothing to do with that is not the vast majority of issues. If the robot's not in the room, somebody would have noticed like eons ago. What happens much more often is like a smaller technical tool is not available, but nobody ever thinks about that, right? It's become so routinized for us to go through these all stops that people just say yes, because, and what's interesting is you assume that there's going to be holdups in the surgery because not all the equipment is in the room, and yet we still don't stop fully to evaluate because those things are so small and we don't realize that we need them later in the process. Like, you get halfway through the surgery and you're like, oh yeah, I need the book Walter, but you just didn't. It's like there's so many things that you need, you don't think about it. I don't quite know how to explain that, but it is kind of a it's this normalization of this process, but we're not actually thinking about the issues that we need to be thinking about. And in some ways, that's because we're human and we just can't think about every single step all the way down. We don't have a safety system in place.
So like, what would be an alternative to that? Like, you have to have some sort of system, right?
I mean, I think that's the struggle. Like there's a whole field of like safety they call it QI. There's like a whole field that's trying to figure out like what solution do you make to that.
So I did actually in the business school, they have us do a case on, it was focused more on safety, like not leaving things in people's bodies. But essentially, as part of that, they designed a process where, like, you said, okay, we're going to do like these things during the surgery. And then there's like a central processing location where they would put together the kit for you.
Mm-hmm.
And like everything was barcoded, and they said like, okay, if you're doing XYZ, like I have to like check in every instrument that's going into this kit, and they deliver the kit, and then it comes back, and like we check it all back in to be sure that nothing's living in the body, or nothing was left behind in the body. But then that way there's like someone who's actually responsible for doing that.
Yeah, and so that process actually works great, I should say. So we have a very low rate of things getting left in the body, and I've been a part of multiple cases where there were discrepancies, and we like everything got totally derailed, and the surgery took 2 extra hours because we literally were searching the entire OR for a single needle, right? Because we were not going to close the body. So it's so interesting because that worked, but that is that question is everything in the kit, is everything that comes into the OR leaving the OR? But the issue that I'm seeing the laxity and safety culture is, are the right things in the kit for this particular surgery and this particular surgeon? And that's a harder problem to solve because that's varies from case to case to some extent and not to other extents. And I don't know why we haven't been able to figure out a better way to do that.
What's the relationship between safety culture and safety processes or safety checklists?
Incoming call from 406-731-1145.
Sorry.
Incoming call from
Was that a question for me or just in general?
I guess like the safety process is, I guess I would draw the dividing line between like, you've got the process, which is set up to hopefully be like as foolproof as possible. And then the culture is like, do I care enough about the process to like put in the effort that is required? I guess like, am I going through the motions, or am I identifying problems and doing the work to flag them? That's,
Or
I don't know,
I mean,
sorry, that's a
also,
little pushy.
couldn't also it be, you know, having the resources necessary to do that? I mean, I like whenever I know not so much obviously about healthcare management, but I know a lot of, you know, I've heard a lot, especially during COVID, about how this like it really made very clear all of the how tight the system was already, like especially in hospitals that operating under administrators that are prioritizing cost cutting and like maintaining a profit and running near capacity all the time. And that sort of got off. But what I think of starting with is just like, you know, being able to actually, you know, there can be an espoused safety culture. And this reminds me of, gosh, who was it now? But like the notion of having, you know, espoused institutional goals that are not backed up with the resources necessary to actually, you know, carry them out. And so that I think is probably part of that, you know, getting from safety culture, at least supposedly safety culture, to the process is actually happening.
I'm going on to the next group. Thanks.
I wonder if you're seeing that now also.
If you have patients that that survive, and so you have an incentive to take on folks that you think are going to make it and not provide it as a care or push it on to other doctors, right? If you think that someone is a lost case or something.
That's interesting. That's something that in a very different system, but facing, I think, similar pressures between like production, sort of, so to speak, and like actual relationships, is that you hear that something echoed in like certain employment related programs. Like they won't, people that don't necessarily want TANF caseloads where people are going to be like super resource intensive because they won't be able to serve their other clients very well.
Do you think, you know, to the last point to discuss here, I mean, what do you all think of doctors reporting their mistakes, or not just the doctors, but anybody in there? I mean, if you're a nurse and you make a mistake, do you adequately report it? Or in this environment, is there like a fear of retribution or lawsuits?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's my whole answer is I think malpractice suits.
I would definitely, support that sentiment. I know for a fact that doctors just tend to hate lawyers because of that, just as a general bias, I guess. But of course, if you are, or if you go to a hospital and they know you're an attorney, they'll be like, oh, we better do everything right when it comes to this person, or they're going to sue us. Is always their fear.
My sister-in-law is a doctor, and she this summer was telling me about something they do. I think it's like once a month, where they sort of do like an informal case study of a case that went wrong recently. And so it is this attempt to kind of revisit what steps were taken, and not even necessarily to like assign blame, but just to understand like how much of this was like surgeon error, how much of it was failure to communicate, et cetera. I think it's a really interesting approach because it kind of subverts the norms of like, if you were concerned about reporting failure, or about like calling someone else out if you thought that they were doing something unsafe to patients, it's actually like a very transparent culture of like, here's a case that went like horribly wrong, and let's like in a communal setting try to understand why that was. And I think it's done in a way where people are like relatively anonymous, but the idea is to encourage that because it's a mode of knowledge sharing. And I don't know if it came up in this reading, but I think it was maybe one of the last readings that talked about how like a reluctance to report on failures, and also a sense of like twisting the narrative for the public, can make it really hard to learn lessons because you don't actually know to what extent something failed, or like learning around the Cuban Missile Crisis, like just how close we were to disaster so many times. Like there's an incentive to misrepresent that to the public so that we have continued faith in our government. And it struck me as like a real loss, because that level of transparency could then lead to the type of knowledge sharing that ensures you don't have a close call Cuban Missile style crisis later on.
Right.
So I wonder if some of it is that kind of like transparency culture, whether that's present in an organization, because otherwise I think there's so many incentives to try to keep stuff under the radar. And I think the only other like accountability mechanism is, like Carly said, like these malpractice suits. I think it's like getting a really litigious patient, but otherwise I'm sure there are like tons of tiny mistakes that go under the radar, especially thinking about this time period of COVID where doctors are very, very overstretched serving a huge amount of people.
Now, you said that was your sister-in-law.
Yep. Yeah.
Is
She does like internal medicine.
Is she at a teaching hospital, or is she like a university affiliated hospital, or?
Yes. Yeah. She's at the University of Vermont Medical Center. And so I think that is part of the purpose, right? It's like, because it's a teaching hospital, there is sort of greater incentive to dig through the cases that go really wrong.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the particulars of a story. It was on a podcast. I think it was on an episode of Revealed. But there was Stanford University Medical Center had a doctor who made like a consistent mistake on patients, and the patients just happened to be children, and like several of them died. But the hospital never admitted fault. They paid out the families. There was a settlement. But the hospital never admitted fault for anything that went wrong. Probably because, I mean, there's a lot of things at stake. Reputation, there's the legal aspects of things. But how do you think that kind of culture, when like a medical institution has to protect both, their goal is to take care of patients, but they have like a reputation to protect. They have like their individual doctors to protect who like might make a mistake, but they're just practicing. So like, I guess like how do you deal with these issues in medicine? Like what could be done?
It's almost the subject of one of the other groups, but having a completely consistent safety culture that says patient safety is our highest priority. So Carolina, your sister-in-law's unit, you could interpret that meeting in a very positive way, that it's an effort to be honest about performance, honest about mistakes. There is a field of thought, there are people in the healthcare world who believe that admitting errors is absolutely the right thing to do, and it doesn't lead to more malpractice suits. In fact, it may even reduce the malpractice rates because patients are more satisfied. Okay, you made a mistake, it was harmful, but I understand that and you were honest about it. So you could say it's a part of safety culture.
I think that's interesting. I assume it still has to be a fear in a lot of places, though. Like they're reluctant to admit fault just because of that.
Right. But you're right about that. There was an executive vice president for medicine or for health affairs at the University of Michigan, Kelch. Bob Kelch was his name. He was a complete advocate for the idea of admit the mistakes. The health system must admit its mistakes. And he made a national reputation for himself in that way. But he did it out of his own beliefs. And during that period of time anyway, the University of Michigan kind of followed that philosophy. I don't know if it still does. I'm gonna go on to the other group, but thanks for welcoming me.
Work and stuff, and they can't transfer it directly to my patient portal at UHS, so I can. It's a whole thing. I have to do it every single time, and it's bizarre.
That's absurd.
Yeah.
And government healthcare is exactly the same. So it's in between agencies. Like I went to work from Department of Defense and switched over to Department of State. I said I needed all of my immunizations all over again, and it was for the past 12 years, and I was like, it's a mess.
Was that a failure of patient medical records that you were referring to, Kyle?
Go ahead, Kyle. Sorry.
Bill?
Yeah, we're both talking about just the issue of like transferring records between different doctors and different hospital systems and how complex it is. And I was thinking, I don't know if I would say it's unnecessarily complex because there's obviously like sensitive data, and if the more open the system, the more insecure it is. But it definitely seems overly complex for the patient.
I think on my end for like Department of Defense, because kind of readiness is our hot button right now. So our medical system is very streamlined, at least information wise. So everything we do is all digital, and it's pretty easy to get from anywhere. But then one would think that you could just use a similar system throughout all of the federal government, but the Department of State still does everything on paper copies. So there's no digital system whatsoever. So we found that interesting when we arrived overseas.
That is totally shocking to me. I'm amazed at that.
Yeah. They wouldn't even recognize my immunizations on my cell phone. I had to print out the copy and bring it to them. But it was better than going to do the healthcare system on the economy over there, which was wonderful as well.
They still take your fingerprints though, right?
What's that?
I said they still take your fingerprints though, right? Like the government, like at a government level, it's not paper, it's like your fingerprints.
It depends, but yes, for us, they're digital now.
Right.
So we're going to talk about digital patient record software a little bit later in the semester, but all by itself, it's a really interesting topic. And I have had providers at the University of Michigan tell me that they really worry about Epic in terms of entry of data, and that the human interface just doesn't make them completely confident that they're getting the right data into the right patient. And I don't say that to mean that we shouldn't use digital medical records, but as a source of error, or a potential source of error, I think that Nancy Levison's work really kind of gives us reason to think there should be a lot of attention focused on the effectiveness of digital medical records.
Sarah, did you want to jump in with your previous point about like transferring one and works in one system? Or do you want me to explain it? I don't want to like take, I don't want to like take it, but like, I thought that was a really good point here. Earlier, she talked about how like the patient portals and how they have been very effective, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean, and you can jump in at any time, that doesn't necessarily mean that transferring them and using them in a different way, or like expanding it, or that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work well. And it could also just like open everything up to, you know, cyber attacks or losing patient data, or, you know, transferring data the way that it's not supposed to be. And so then it's harder to distinguish which patient gets what care. Yeah.
And really, like the same mistakes, like, you know, it's easy to laugh because there were no like human casualties at the scientists in America who were using feet, and the scientists elsewhere who were using the metric system. But you can also see that happening as you're transferring from paper records to these digital portals of, you know, maybe height isn't that important, but making sure all of the same metrics were used and the data is sort of like classified. So going from these legacy systems to this new highly complex database where, like she said, with software, if it, you know, if it can do it, there's a tendency to say it must do it. And so like, all right, well now on top of storing all that stuff, let's also store all of this other data that's maybe not as relevant, but we might as well put it in there.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm going to go and close the rooms, but thanks. Looks like you're all back. I certainly thought the three conversations that I kind of got a quick listen to were going very well. Unfortunately, I kind of mistimed things. I'm sorry. So the breakout reports, I don't think we can handle those tonight. I don't want to keep you longer than I should. But we will be talking about healthcare and hospital and patient safety in about 4 or 5 weeks. And I think this is a really good beginning conversation. We're going to come back to Nancy Levison also, because she also has written about patient safety. And so the conversations that you've had this evening will also be very relevant for the discussion we'll have. I just looked up in the syllabus, it's week 11, so it's about I guess it's about 5 weeks from now. Just a reminder, the first presentations are November something or other. And let's see who's on. Right. I think you probably know who's on for November. Is it 2nd? November 2nd? I don't have any dates in my, it's kind of a dopey used here, but let's take a look at the syllabus just for a second.
I believe it might be my group, which is me, Nomandari, and Annalisa.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, it's group. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it is November 2nd. That's the good news. So group 1 and group 2 are making their presentations, but I didn't put the names of those groups in, so I'm not sure who it is. But just to make sure that you all know what the calendar is, I'm sorry to make a mystery of it. It is on the Google Doc. And I'm really looking forward to your work and your presentations. If you're having any challenges of any sort, I'm happy to talk to individuals in the group or the whole group. Very happy to be helpful in any way I can. So thank you. And I look forward to talking with you all next week. Thanks. Bye.